First responders, what is the worst injury you've seen that was caused by the stupidest and most easy to avoid event? Story 1. A theater was being renovated. The theater was designed for a specific show, and that show left after something like a 15-year run. One of the design quirks of the theater was a concrete basement underneath the stage, where machinery would push up some pretty impressive set changes from below. This means the stage had giant open holes in it after all that machinery and stuff was cleared out of the basement. The holes in the stage opened up to a 30-foot drop with bare concrete beneath. The crew who was tearing down the stuff on the stage took some precautions to make sure nobody fell into those holes. They put plywood over the holes and set up caution cones all around them. When they finished tearing down all the stuff on the stage, the last things remaining were those cones and plywood. Someone picked up all the cones, and it was our future patient's job to pick up the plywood. These were long sheets of plywood, too big to just throw over his shoulder. So he just picked up one side of the plywood sheet and started walking forward, pushing it along the stage floor. He never even saw the hole he fell through, because the plywood he was pushing blocked his view of his own feet. He fell 30 feet and tumbled on the way down, landing directly only with his outstretched hands. He had multiple nasty compound fractures in both arms. Luckily, the shattering bones of his arms broke a lot of the momentum, so when his head smashed into the concrete, it wasn't enough to unalive him. It knocked him unconscious and knocked out all the teeth on one side of his head. It also crushed and dislocated his jaw. The radial ulnar fractures were the worst. His hands just hung limply, with gore everywhere, and his bones clearly exposed on both forearms. He woke up while we were preparing him for ambulance transport. He mumbled something to us, but his speech was garbled and fracked, mostly due to his injury, but also due to the spinal immobilization we put on him, which tucks underneath the chin. He kept mumbling, "Maha, maha-hu." After a while, I realized he was trying to tell us that his hands hurt, which makes sense, considering the circumstances. If he fell 30 feet onto concrete, then he was dang lucky just to have survived. I had a bike accident. I fell over my bicycle and I face planted on blacktop. I had one little fracture on a wrist. I cracked both of my front teeth, and thankfully I was wearing a helmet. I find myself lucky that I did not experience near the trauma and pain this person went through. Story 2. I was a firefighter, and we were called to a vehicle fire at midnight in a rural area. We got there, and sure enough, there was a pickup truck fully engulfed. This wasn't the usual engine compartment fire. The whole truck was roaring. I was the nozzle man at the time on my engine, which meant my job was to be the guy spraying water on the fire. As I got closer to the pickup, I noticed a deity awful smell. I was relatively new, so I couldn't place it, but just knew it was putrid. My heart immediately sank when I remembered there was a missing girl case in our area. People often stash evidence inside cars and burn the whole thing to get rid of evidence. Guns, clothes, even bodies. As I'm putting out the fire, I'm dreading what I'll find. Something was in the trunk bed. The fact that the truck's owner wasn't on the scene made me more nervous. Fast forward, and the fire's out. Turns out, the truck bed was filled with dozens of pumpkins. Thankfully, no bodies, but we had no idea where the driver was. A few days later, we heard from the cops that just before we arrived at the fire, a lone guy showed up at the ER with massive full-body burns. Turns out that as this guy was driving his pumpkins to a nearby farmer's market, he hit something in the road. His gas gauge went empty, and he smelled gas coming from his truck. The hero of this story crawled under his truck to assess the damage and used the only light source he had, a Bic lighter. Someone saw the fire and drove him to the ER. Some separate passerby was the only one who actually called in the fire. Too long didn't read? If you think you have a gas leak, don't use a lighter as your light source. Considering this is October, this is probably the most apropos story of this. I can imagine that this person who was driving had his hands full with a guy who had severe burns and probably couldn't really risk talking on the phone to the police and driving this person to the hospital at the same time. I'm pretty sure this guy did the right thing and concentrated on getting this burn victim treatment as soon as possible. Very brave of him. Story 3. I'm a cop. About 4:45 in the morning, we got a call of a burglary in progress. Now, we get off at 6:30 and have a whole night of paper right before we go home. So we weren't exactly stoked to do this. Anyways, I get there first, and the 2 occupants come running out and say a dude was trying to break in and smash a window to do it, so they ran. I'm thinking active burglary is in process, so I get my buddy rolling code 3 in case this turns sideways. We get the house surrounded and decided we would frack it, and we got to approach somehow. We look through the fence and see what looks like a person laying on the ground. We make entry into the backyard, and sure enough, there's a person laying on the ground right by the rear door. Only now, we can also see shattered glass and a massive amount of blood. We push into the backyard, and the guy is clearly gone. Medics on scene confirmed it. After further inspection, we realized that this clown broke the window and sliced his arm deep, right where your bicep meets your forearm. He then walked from that location to the rear door and tried to enter there for a long time by how much blood was pooled on the ground and on the door. He ended up passing away face up, spread eagle right by the door. The homeowners had no idea who he was. I ended up going home before the whole thing was wrapped up, and I never got confirmation on anything. But our best guess was this knucklehead was so high on Walter White crystals, he thought that this house was his, and ended up smashing the window trying to get in when he couldn't open the door, cut himself, and just passed away. I'm a cop. Scatter! I think we're so used to the movies seeing everybody just break through plate glass on a regular basis, almost like it's a common occurrence, that I think there's only been a few movies that have showcased that trying to break through a glass door is actually very dangerous, and you will almost always cut yourself very deeply, and blood loss is very imminent. And I think this is just proof that real life is a little bit more dangerous than the movies look. Story 4. 25 years in the fire service. Pick one. A. Dropping your hard rock pipe into your bed and burning off all your skin and a lot of flesh. B. Getting drunk and hitting a tree sideways with your Grand Cherokee so hard that the frame rails met on the other side. Oh, and not being identified for 4 days because all you had was a fake ID. C. Stopping your car on the side of I-95 to pee at 2 a.m., getting out on the traffic side, and getting waffled by a truck. Seriously, fracking drunk drivers. Nothing beats getting out of bed at 1 a.m., spending 5 hours watching the statutes do their investigation, then going to work on 2 hours sleep. Here's one from within the last year that I didn't have to deal with directly. Some butthole walked into traffic for a self-unaliving at 5 a.m. on 95 in Greenwich, Connecticut. Got himself flattened, but the trucker didn't notice, and traffic kept running him over until 9. I went over the smear around 6:30 and noticed the clothes everywhere. 4 hours of the New York City commuter rush hour drove over that guy's carcass. Story 5. There was an SUV full of teenagers driving down the highway in busy traffic. They're driving pretty aggressively. They try to pass a truck, But the truck is towing a trailer and can't slow down quickly enough to let them pass before oncoming traffic gets close. So they slow down and try to make a second pass. The 15-year-old in the back seat decides to pull his pants down and hang his butt out and moon the other car. Once they passed, they overcorrected and rolled. The kid doing the mooning was ejected and left half his brains and his left arm in a 75-foot line down the middle of the highway. I didn't invent the phrase meat crayon for road accidents, but this was the first in this thread that reminded me of it. It's grim as frack. Story 6. My dad is a police officer, and in the first few weeks he was working, he had 2 really bad accident calls. The first one was on a local highway where a guy had lost control of his U-Haul and flipped it. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt and was ejected. He landed, most likely already unalive, and the truck came to rest on his head. Only his head. The other one is more gruesome. A homeless man was sleeping under garbage when a garbage truck drove onto him trying to get closer to the dumpster. I know this has been said many times, I think even in Deadpool, but he described it as if you ran over a tube of toothpaste. The top popped, and the bottom was completely flat. And I wish I didn't read the toothpaste analogy. My mind, for some reason, pictured both of these incidents happening at night. I think simply because the night is going to hide a lot of the literal gory details, and I think that's about the only way my mind is dealing with these right now, especially with a lot more stories up ahead. Story 7. Thankfully, I didn't see it, as our response was over the phone. But we got a call from a car that had done a rollover and no one was responding, so we got the police out there as soon as possible. At some point, a bystander came to the car and said there was no one inside, which was weird because someone had to have been in there at some point for it to crash, right? Well, about 10 minutes later, the bystander came back to say he'd found the driver, or at least half of him. We had to call the police back and let them know the driver was bisected at the waist. Later on, the bystander reported he found the torso as well. It was a bad day to be a good Samaritan for him, I think. Some of the other people in the office were speculating it was an unaliving cover-up, but he probably just didn't have his seatbelts on. If your car rolls over and half of you is flying out of the window, that's something that happens. Story 8. I've got one about a drunk driver, which is incredibly stupid to me, but this dude was pretty bad off. He was driving on a major road through my hometown, and I happened to be walking to a Taco Bell around 9 p.m. So I kinda saw how it happened, with a man in a large pickup truck going about 120 on this road and slamming into the back of a stopped SUV, who then in turn went spiraling from the force into someone driving on the opposite side of the road. The truck didn't stop, but somehow managed to turn 180 and go in the opposite direction, but drove this time into a ditch and crashed into a telephone pole. I didn't really know which one to go for first, so I chose the truck. When I ran over and opened the driver's side door, the guy was barely conscious and blood was everywhere. The airbag didn't deploy. When I got him to speak to me, I noticed he had no teeth left as they were all over the ground or smashed. I ended up pulling him out of the car and setting him upright, using his phone to call the police and then his wife for his request. I was 16 at the time with no phone of my own. Upon re-inspecting the car is when I noticed all of the alcohol spread out. Could kind of catch it on his breath, but I was taken aback by the blood, I guess. I didn't really stick around too much longer after the fire department and professionals got there, but I heard of it on the news later on. No one was hurt to my knowledge, other than the guy. A real miracle, as the SUV had a baby on board sign from what I remember. No matter what, never drink and drive. Story 9. EMS supervisor of a well-known party campus. Of all the calls with drunk-faced patients, the winner is a freshman who drank 1 beer and attempted to slide down the railing of his 4th-floor dorm stairwell, only to fall 5 stories upside down onto the concrete basement floor with only his head as a cushion. On arrival, The pool of blood, twice his size, gave me no hope when I reached down to check his pulse. To my surprise, he not only survived his ICU hospitalization, he sat next to me on the first day of organic chemistry a year later. This is why, one of my many reasons story. Responding to a young guy that fell out of the shower when he slipped, he impaled a wooden toilet plunger into the side of his chest underneath his armpit. It was literally halfway down the wood into his body. Dude was standing in the living room when we got there, plunger and all. How he was alive, I don't know. Our mouths were open after going home. Had to put him sideways on the stretcher in a position of comfort. Poor guy was just showering. I was skimming, saw shower, slipped, and toilet plunger, and was expecting it to have gone up his butt accidentally. But this was worse than a colon puncture. Personally, I was thinking more along the lines of the bathroom scene from the first Final Destination movie. If you haven't seen that, the first one and I think the second one are pretty cool. I'd check those out. Story 10. Obligatory, not a first responder. My brother was hanging out with our cousin on his birthday. My brother decided to make a quick run to the store for some ice cream. He got on his motorcycle and decided not to wear any gear since it was just a few blocks away. You can see where this is going. He lived in St. George, Utah at the time. A popular activity there is sand duning. Part of doing that is lowering the air pressure in the tires. The motorcycle he took had tires like this. He was going downhill when the motorcycle flipped forward, launching him forward. Luckily, he was thinking quickly enough to cover his head with his arms. His forearms got horrendous road rash. Bits of glass and asphalt had to be picked out, which was the most painful part according to him. He also landed on his knee and skinned it clear to the bone. He only had a couple scratches on his head, but his arms and right knee were messed up. A passerby saw it, called an ambulance, and luckily one was nearby so he didn't have to wait long. To this day, he has big pink patches on his arms, and his right knee is a little weaker than the other. Moral of the story? Even if it's just a couple blocks in town, always wear proper gear. Also, check the air pressure in your tires all the time. Story 11. My mother was a police explorer in the 80s. She later went on to being a 911 dispatcher. She had to do a ride-along as part of police explorers or dispatch training, can't remember. The town she lived in has lots of gravel roads. On a blistering and muggy Iowa summer, the ambulance got called to a motorcycle crash. They were speeding down the gravel, and he was wearing shorts, sandals, and no helmet. He was literally passed across the gravel, which acted like sandpaper. His head split open, and his brains were scattered like a Gallagher show, and the smell is something my mom says she can still smell when she tells the story. Gently cooking brains in gravel mixed with the road dust and raw meat smell. Didn't help that it was super humid, too. The girl riding with him lost 80% of her skin and broke basically everything. She passed away in the hospital before her parents got there. My mom made me swear to never ride motorcycles. My buddy had a pizza truck hit him while on his bike, destroyed his bike and safety gear, but besides being in a lot of pain, he was okay. Story 12. Gunshot wound to the head of a child under 10. His parents left a .40 caliber Glock on a coffee table, the brand being notable only because they lacked the typical safety switch. He didn't make it, and both parents were arrested. I've seen a lot of gory junk online in my time, and some examples in real life, but that is the worst. All because these morons left a loaded chambered gun with no safety at knee level. Absolute stupidity without even considering the father of the child was a convicted felon. I have the sudden urge to go to my kid's school, track him down, and give him a hug. And since the kid's dad is eventually going to inherit some guns, him and I need to have a serious chat about gun safety. Those guns will be in safe, unloaded safeties. Story 13. I was waiting for the bus when I watched an accident happen. Woman waiting at a light has her vehicle rammed into by another woman who was doing her makeup. The vehicle that got hit was a large SUV, and the vehicle that was hitting was a small sports car. So the hitting vehicle basically ran under the other vehicle, which meant the makeup lady got her face gashed up pretty bad by the bumper of the SUV. Like there was a flap of skin hanging off. I've taken off my hoodie and am trying to staunch the blood and get her away from the possibly leaky vehicle when another voice starts coming from the car. The woman had her kid in the car. I should note the occupants of the SUV were largely uninjured. So I had to go back in and gather this woman's child, who, when I got her out, proceeded to puke all over me. Not sure why, but at least I was headed home anyway. I was called as part of the investigation into her reckless driving charge.
Please like and subscribe if you made it this far. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the video and have a wonderful day.
Story 14. I'm not really a first offender, but I was actually just thinking of this the other day. I know a family in my small town that recently lost their son in a car accident. The son and his girlfriend were just driving around late at night on the roads around their farm that they had driven on hundreds of times. They got to talking or something, and he missed a turn, having to swerve and tipping his truck over. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt, so he was thrown out the window and smashed by the truck, terminating him instantly. His girlfriend was wearing her seatbelt and didn't even have a scratch on her. The truck itself was totally drivable. It was kind of dented on the side that it was landed on, but a little hammering out and you wouldn't even know this car was in an accident. But yet, he was terminated. Moral of the story? Wear your seatbelt. Story 15. Dude's two neglected, underfed, unneutered large pit bulls were fighting over the unspayed female dog. Dude stepped in the middle and had his bottom lip entirely removed to the gum line. He was also on a lot of blood thinners. He then pulled his concealed carry weapon and shot the dog, hitting it in the stomach. I felt so bad for that dog for being owned by a freaking moron. It's his fault his dog passed away. I picked the dude's lip up off the ground and packaged it for transport. Dude bled all the frickin' way to the level 1 trauma center an hour away. We ran out of absorbents and had to use a quick clot to get the bleeding stopped. Blood was running out of the back of the ambulance. That would have been a sight to see. Story 16. I was at work, sitting there with my boss. This guy comes running into our office and cries for help, talking about his friend standing outside. We walk out and see another young man holding his hand covered in blood and missing 1.5 fingers. We of course help him by having a first aid kit, and luckily my boss is well taught in first aid. He then got transported by a helicopter. But the interesting thing is how he got his injury. Apparently, the guys were having a barbecue, and he took a circular saw to cut open their buns. I did this so often, it never went wrong. Later learned that they were able to save at least one of his fingers. That's the most overkill way to open a bun that I can imagine. I don't drink, and never will. Story 17. I met a guy while I was in the hospital ER that was getting out after suffering a stab wound to his leg. I asked him what happened, and he told me that his friend stabbed him with a carving knife. I asked him why he would do something like that, and he replied, "We were both drunk and decided to see if I could feel it." At least he had a sense of humor about it. A guy I used to know had a similar story about a house party where somebody got shanked just for the heck of it. I'm pretty sure it was also in his leg, though. It's possible I made up that detail. It wasn't a kitchen knife, though. It was some kind of personal defense knife. Not sure if it was a folding or fixed blade or what. Anyway, the moral of the story is, drunk people are morons. Story 18. Not a first responder, but this reminds me of that one YouTuber that stuck his head in a microwave and then filled it with cement. Like, literally, what did he expect to happen? Did he even know how cement works? That it hardens? Anyway, it was a waste of time for the first responders, in my opinion. Had that guy been smarter, the first responders could have actually saved the life of someone who actually needed help, rather than someone who self-inflicted pain upon themselves. As soon as someone is described as a YouTuber, I instantly assume they're not all that bright. Story 19. Former paramedic. Saw a man lose his life after falling 12 feet. 12 feet ain't that high, but when you land wrong, instant passing. If you work at any height, wear a harness. I always like to remind people, the average human is just tall enough that if they stand up straight and fall rigidly forward or backwards onto solid cement, They will gain just enough energy to impart a likely lethal blow. Apply this to things like curbs or other smaller surface areas, and it's no contest. That's how fracking fragile we are when it comes to gravity, people. Story 20. My cousin is an EMT, and he said one of the nastiest scenes he came upon was a car accident in which the passenger had both of her legs up on the dash, airbags deployed, causing severe fractures on both of her ankles, and pushed her knees into her face, causing a breaking of her eye socket. He said she was fully conscious when he arrived and in incredible pain. If I remember correctly, she survived and was expected to make a full recovery. He has a lot of crazy stories. Mostly Walter White substance and drunk drivers, though. Never putting my legs on the dash again, I guess. Story 21. I'm a paramedic. Saw a woman very messed up due to the lack of wearing a helmet on a job site. A big metal beam fell on her head and then landed on her legs below the knee. Ended up having one leg with a completely broken set of bones beneath the knee, tib-fib for those keen to the lingo. She was super disoriented and had memory problems while I was taking care of her. Would forget everything every 5-ish minutes, and would want to take the splinting off her leg when that happened. Pretty crazy. This submission in a nutshell. Wear your freaking helmets, people. Story 22. The worst injury I've seen caused by something stupid was a man who crashed into a tree on the side of the highway. He had a nice gouge in his scalp and totaled his car. The reason he did this? He imagined the exit was about half a mile earlier than it was and tried to merge off onto the grass. He was also high as hell on whippets. Really strange to find an entire box of NO2 canisters in someone's passenger seat and an empty whipped cream dispenser, which is the stupidest illegal substance I can think of besides huffing paint. Story 23. Not my story, but one that my paramedic dad has told me a couple of times. A lady was standing under a massive oak tree in her yard after a nasty storm had damaged it. One of the limbs, as thick as the trunk on a normal street tree, was cracked, and this lady was just staring up at it trying to figure out what to do when it broke off and crushed her. Apparently, it absolutely pancaked her torso and head, but left her limbs just fine. My dad describes it as exactly like a Bugs Bunny cartoon. Story 24. I work in a hospital. There's a lot of stupid stuff I've seen. Climbing things and falling off them is a big one. Skateboarding without helmets. I know helmets look embarrassing when skateboarding, but a guy came off his board and was in an induced coma for a week after cracking his head open, for Pete's sake. My mom nearly passed away because she wasn't wearing a helmet while biking. Seeing my dad on his hands and knees screaming desperately into my mom's ears trying to wake her up was the best helmet PSA that 5-year-old me ever got. Story 25. Rolled up on a guy that had oven cleaner burns on his arms from the shoulder down. He had schizophrenia and forgot to take his meds. He took oven cleaner, rubbed them on his arms, sat in his recliner for 2 hours, then called 911. All we could do was flush his arms with saline and dry bandage him before taking him to the hospital. People are crazy. Well, the guy is schizophrenic. Story 26. Can't decide, so I'll take 2. Worst injuries, bikers who thought going 300 kilometers per hour on a German autobahn is a good idea because it's legal. Stupidest? A guy who climbed a fence to sneak into an open-air concert. His engagement ring got caught on the top of the chain-link fence when he jumped down, which degloved his finger and part of his hand. It was past 10 p.m., so the gates were open and the entrance was free. Story 27. 911 call for a guy with abdominal pain. Found out the guy had shoved an egg up his butt for spicy pleasure. After he had conducted his self-love, he couldn't extract the egg. He grabs a spoon and tries to break the egg to get it out. This really happened. Dude cuts open his rectum and eventually passes away from complications. All to save $50 on a reusable vibrating egg. Story 28. Some guy decided kicking a running mower blade that was jammed up was a great idea. He was nice enough to bring his foot in, though, in a cooler full of beer. My boss's husband was mowing the lawn when the blades got jammed. decided to unclog it with his bare hand. Lost the tips of all of his fingers. Story 29. An 8-year-old who got his leg chopped off by an industrial-sized lawnmower. His parents wanted him to help out around the neighborhood. He hit a curb and tilted himself out of the driver's seat and promptly got run over. Probably shouldn't give an 8-year-old a 2-sided lawnmower. Shouldn't let an 8-year-old use a lawnmower in general. Story 30. Guy wanted to see what a dong ring felt like, so he used his wedding ring. Couldn't get it off and was ashamed to ask for help until it started turning black and blue and was in extreme pain. Either dude has giant hands or a deity damn spaghetti dong. Story 31. Firefighter here. Teenage boy ducked and rolled from a car traveling 40-ish miles per hour because a bee got into the car and he was allergic to bees. Story 32. Personally speaking, as a stupid person, I nearly cut a chunk of my hand off because I was cutting carrots on a mandolin without using the guard. I still have a scar and I haven't touched the dang thing since. Story 33. My father-in-law is a firefighter, but the area mostly has car accidents. So many people have their lives ruined by speeding or driving drunk. So many.
Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.